Today, I had the pleasure of meeting Charles Deam as he visited the IU Herbarium. He has kindly allowed me this rare opportunity to interview him. So howdy, Mr. Deam.
Well, first off, it's Charlie, plain old Charlie. I must admit, though, I dressed for this occasion and took my semi-annual bath. It pleased the missus. I also shaved so as not to be mistaken for a dog and shot.
Thank you, Charlie. So let me begin by asking you, how did you come to be alive here in 2021?
Well, to answer your question about my longevity, I always told my friends when I reported to be dead, just say, Deam, how about a botany trip to Tennessee and see whether I don't immediately get up and go. No, despite my bad eyesight and weak heart, I'm an old hog just rooting around with the boys. Maybe soon general debility will give the command, and I will obey.
Looking back over your long life, how did you become interested in plants?
Well, I came to it through the back door. I grew up on a farm, you see, plebeian born, and couldn't wait to leave. So I learned the drugstore trade and drove myself to succeed with my own store in Bluffton, Indiana. It was rather successful, if I do say so. We were located right in town, along with 16 saloons and 2 houses of ill fame, but I stayed there for 60 years. Getting back to your question, though, about my interest in plants, you may notice that I'm plain of speech, and I can be impatient in the best of times. My motto was, work like hell and never spare an extra cent. But one day, an old biddy was in the store just a-wasting my time. It made me explode. A visiting salesman bluntly told me I needed a hobby to vent that steam, or my business was going to kill me. Well, my dear wife Stella and I began walks in the country. We enjoyed seeing the posies. Yeah, Stella always was a lover of her flower garden.
But how did your initial interest grow from there? After all, you had no formal training in botany, but at some point decided to do a detailed flora of the entire state.
You're right about the lack of training. I didn't know that flowers had names until I was 32. Well, I had tried a year at the PAW, but ran out of money, so I quit. And anyway, it took too much time, and I already knew more than they could teach me. Turns out, anyway, that we had a young nature enthusiast, a college biology student in Bluffton named Bruce Williamson. He steered me towards the available books and helped me learn the rudiments of plant collecting. My habit of attention to detail took it from there. So as early as 1895, we made forays into the wilder parts of Wells and Whitley counties. I'm pleased to say that Bruce went on to become a zoology professor at University of Michigan. So, in a way, my schooling was by one of the finest. Well, since by the turn of the 20th century, my drugstore business was thriving, I took on a partner. That allowed me and Stella to do some real collecting trips with Bruce, including long ones to Guatemala. But then, starting about 1901, you may recall the fine leadership we had in the White House, that Teddy Roosevelt guy. So by 1905, his conservation movement in the United States and here in Indiana made me realize how quickly our region was changing. And yet we did not even have a full list of the species present, let alone where they occurred or which ones were notably rare. So in fact, there were still undescribed plant species to be discovered. Curiously, though, I had interest in conservation of good plant collecting sites, but I didn't know that crazy bird lady in nearby Adams County. nor the pioneering efforts by that Coles feller over in the Dunes region.
As an aside, we should note that plain old Charlie is linked to the discovery of several dozen species of plants new to science, and some occur right here in Indiana. To get back to the early days, Charlie, what was it like to do botany in the first decade of the 20th century?
Yeah, here we are less than 120 years later with roads and sprawled out cities and towns everywhere. In my early years, the road system was mostly local. They certainly were unpaved. They were rutted, just suitable for horse and buggy. I did plenty of Shanks mare, for you young'uns, that means walking. And I traveled some by bicycle and even motorcycle. But rail was the best way to get anywhere far. So for several years, I took the train to a distant part of the state and then botanized a local area. So in 1905, I went to Veedersburg in the western Indiana, and in 2006 to Morganstown in south central Indiana. But, that wasn't satisfactory. So I decided to try out my idea of a weed wagon. And so in 1908, I rigged up my wagon with a straw mattress for sleeping and places to store equipment for camping, and off I went. But another break came after the establishment of that Clark State Forest, the first in the state. That led to the creation in 1909 of the position of Secretary of the State Board of Forestry. When offered to me, I was reluctant to take it at first. But, once I got my new office in Indianapolis, I found that I could take the Dixie Flyer train from Indy to Clark Forest, get that trip done, and spend time documenting the flora, as well as directing the forest management experiments that were going on there.
But at some point, you transitioned from train and horse to automobile. What impact did that have upon your work?
Yep. In 1915, I bought my Model T truck. It's my second weed wagon. Boy, it too was rigged up with sleeping quarters. I had a straw mattress, but also hang a hammock above it, so we had double layers. And I could pack my collecting equipment, my Coleman stove, and my provisions. Boy, one can live on canned beans, peaches, pancakes, and coffee for a long time. And my expenses, they were only 19 cents a day. Now I covered an amazing amount of territory by hustling down roadways all the while keeping my eyes peeled and watching for plants and collecting sites along the road. Yep, that weed wagon, it allowed me to get to interesting parts of the state and interesting parts of any one county, no matter how remote. After all, you have to get to the cow before you can milk it.
So yes, this gives me some sense of your strategy for plant collecting. But could you amplify further on your strategy for studying Indiana's flora?
But the extreme north and extreme south of the state were the most poorly known botanically, and yet both had a fascinating flora. I was especially keen on Posey County, with that southern influences, but in northern Indiana, I spent decades adding species to my list for Steuben County. That species count seemed endless. But in the flat midsection of the state, one could focus on just finding sites near a river or a large stream. That way you could quickly sample the broad range of habitats with the greatest efficiency. So I didn't waste my time with large portions of those counties, and I'm one known for efficiency. I must admit, though, my biases toward documenting only native plant species. So as a result, I confess that I avoided settled areas entirely. And I also should have spent more time walking railroad lines, since they acted as sources of invading species.
What were the hazards you encountered in those days on the road?
Well, of course, plenty of flat tires. I still have each of those items that punctured my tires, including the date and location. I also got to where I could smell snake territory. Boy, that was important for my well-being, because if I saw one, Lot's wife would not have anything on me. I turned to stone. But I had my machete sharp, and I retained my consciousness long enough to use it before eyes freeze up. Then there were those curious people. I remember one night when Ralph Wilcox was with me in the weed wagon. He was in the hammock above, me lying on a straw mattress, and we heard commotion of men and dogs out in the dark. I whispered up to Ralph, "You do the talking, and if they bother us, I'll do the shooting from down here." Well, happily Ralph explained our presence, and the men left quietly.
Oh, so did others help you with your work on the Flora of Indiana?
That is a big question. Well, first off, I must comment that as early as 1900, I became active in the Indiana Academy of Science. It was an opportunity to connect with the like-minded souls, folks like Stanley Coulter at Purdue University. And they were willing to tolerate my boring reports on species that I was adding to the flora. Yep, I liked the fraternity, and I found their heads were flat. To adequately complete the flora, though, I found it important to reach out to experts wherever they lived. I suspect they found it of mutual benefit, too. I sent duplicate specimens to folks like Albert Hitchcock at Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. He helped with grasses and the like. And also sent specimens to Liberty High Bailey at Cornell. He worked with the blackberry genus, that's Rubus. So based upon my specimens, the full treatment was for some of those really tough groups in the flora that was done by others. Sedges was done by Fred Herman at University of Michigan, and Hawthorns by Ernest Palmer. But it's not my way to boast, but I had to do a proper job of collecting to satisfy these folks. But I was extremely pleased this last summer to learn that my blackberry and dewberry collections got a thorough review by a modern-day expert. And I heard that the completeness of my specimens, they served him well, and he loved them.
That does raise the question of how did you decide where your herbarium collection should go as you wrapped up the Flora project?
Yes, much to the chagrin of my friend Dan Deneuve at Purdue University, I did not let my collection go there. One underlying reason was an incident that I observed during the Great War when they housed Army trainees in the gymnasium. I happened to visit the herbarium facility and found that specimens had been on the floor to make a clean path from shower to quarters. I mean, such taxonomic desecration just rankles my memory even today. But more than that, Indiana University courted me for the collection, and I've become great friends with Paul Weatherwax. You may recall that together, Weatherwax and I published The Grasses of Indiana in 1929. So I agreed to 10 cents a sheet, and as I finished a portion of the flora, I shipped them off to Bloomington. For many years, they had a very serviceable, if somewhat cramped location in the main biology building, which was Jordan Hall. The only negatives I would offer about Indiana U was their complaint that I kept collecting more specimens, even though they were receiving such a treasure at rock bottom price. But I also worry about the future of the herbarium there, since it is now located on that periphery of campus and has a starvation budget for operations.
It sounds to me as though you're needing to share a pet peeve.
Yes, I have always found academic biology to be dominated by too many swivel chair teachers. And then, too, those big schools, they're saturated with athletics, which for the most part is the skid way to hell.
Well, Charlie, you not only wrote The Flora of Indiana, but also volumes covering grasses and shrubs and trees. A truly remarkable achievement. What was it like for you to write those volumes?
Yes, I had in mind it was a great mark of literary achievement to write so no one could understand it. If that were true, I should receive the knighthood. But then again, if the writing were too faultless, the reader will know I never wrote it.
Your work on Indiana's flora took place over more than a 35-year period, and also a period of great change in the state. What were some of those changes that you observed during those decades?
Oh, yes, well, many. For example, in the early years, I found a site with 20 acres of Delphinium tricornia in Dearborn County. Places like that keep disappearing. For another, I would point to the condition of our rivers. You know, it is written in the Bible that Jesus walked on the water, and some doubt this, but they do not take into account the condition of the Wabash River. Of course, the third is the increasing presence of non-native species, some of which were recommended by our USDA folks. You know, the ones with the briefcases and, instead of carpet bags, and a toothbrush in their vest pocket and a fancy fountain pen. I understand that they strongly recommended that old cemeteries be planted with multiflora rows. I tell you, when Gabriel sounds his horn, I'm afraid many will be stranded, unable to get through those roses. Yeah, early in my years, many European species were introduced in the cheap grass seed which the country was being flooded with. So I began to see species like reed canary grass during the Great War.
After the 1940 flora, there continued to be changes, of course. What did you see as the most notable?
Yeah, the pace of species introduction has sped up. My species list in 1940 had about 18% non-native species. Today, that's more like 33 or 35%. And although I complain about multiflora rows, our cities now are overwhelmed with bush honeysuckle and our woods with garlic mustard, and neither of those were in the state whatsoever in 1940.
And finally, Charlie, where do you see the study of Indiana's flora going in this 21st century?
I sure would like to be part of it, I tell you. I want to visit old places and new ones as well, but I would have to pay dearly. My wife says travel would kill me, and the fact is, I cannot stand but one such experience. But then again, mentioning a trip is like seeing a pretty girl. It perks up my weak heart and my poor eyes. Well, anyway, more to the point, I am passing the responsibility onto younger folks. I am tickled to see this youngster, Rich Hull from IU, doing a fine-grained flora of one of my favorite parts of the state, the lower Wabash Valley. He is revisiting many of my old sites and providing an intensive picture of how the flora has changed. And he's also setting the stage for understanding how climate change, whatever that is, will further alter this flora. Certainly in 1905, when I began to study Indiana flora, one could never have imagined the Armageddon that has taken place. Free enterprise has robbed the country of its timber and its soil fertility. This vogue going about free enterprise is the most dangerous propaganda we have ever had.
Thank you, Charlie. Any parting words of wisdom for our audience before a question and answer period?
Yes. Botany is my game and I play it hard, and I recommend that you do too.